Imagine waking up to a world that changed overnight, not slowly, not gradually, but in a single violent shudder that cracked the foundation of the most watched conflict on the planet. Imagine a morning where the screens light up, the alerts flood in, and the name of one building echoes across every intelligence channel, every war room, every diplomatic corridor from Washington to Beijing. That building is not in a remote battlefield. It is not a hidden bunker buried beneath foreign soil. It is the very nerve center of Israeli military power, the Ministry of Defense compound in Tel Aviv. And the claim that just detonated across global media is this: Iran's Revolutionary Guards did not just strike it, they claim they walked through it. Before you dismiss that as impossible, before you reach for the word propaganda, before you assume this is just another cycle of inflammatory rhetoric from a regime that has long specialized in psychological warfare, stop. Because what makes this particular claim different, what separates it from every other piece of IRGC theater, is the volume of detail that has accompanied it. This is not a vague statement of defiance. This is not a general boast broadcast from a podium. This is a specific, structured, and strategically timed declaration that names locations, describes operations, and attaches a number to American casualties so large, 500 soldiers, that the silence from Washington in the hours that followed became its own kind of answer. Because in geopolitics, when a claim this explosive is made, silence is never innocent. To understand what is truly at stake here, you have to go back, not just weeks or months, but years, to trace the architecture of what Iran has been building in the shadows while the world fixated on drone strikes and nuclear negotiations. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not simply a military branch. It is a state within a state, a parallel power structure that operates with a mandate that goes far beyond conventional warfare. It controls intelligence networks that stretch across 4 continents. It maintains proxy armies embedded in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. It has cultivated a doctrine of what its own strategists call strategic patience, the deliberate accumulation of capability, the mapping of vulnerabilities, the waiting for the precise moment when the psychological blow would land with maximum force. That moment, according to Tehran's own narrative, has now arrived. The claim emerged not from a single source, but from multiple simultaneous announcements, a coordinated communication architecture that itself tells a story. Senior IRGC commanders appeared in state media. Footage was referenced, though not fully released in the initial hours. Statements were issued in Farsi, Arabic, and English, a trilingual broadcast strategy that signals intent to reach not just domestic audiences, but the Arab street, the international press, and the halls of Western power simultaneously. The message was constructed for maximum psychological penetration, and at its center was that number, 500, not 50, not 100, 500 American military personnel, claimed dead in what the IRGC described as a direct and coordinated response to what they called decades of occupation, interference, and aggression. Now here is where the analysis has to be both ruthless and precise, because the distance between a claim and a verified fact in this theater of war is not a small gap. It is sometimes an entire alternate reality. The IRGC has a documented history of inflating casualty numbers. After the 2020 ballistic missile strike on Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, the strike launched in retaliation for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, Iran initially claimed over 80 American deaths. The United States ultimately acknowledged over 100 traumatic brain injuries, but no fatalities. The gap between those two realities was enormous. So when a number like 500 surfaces, the trained analytical mind must immediately ask, is this a report or is this a weapon? Is this journalism, or is this warfare conducted through language? But then comes the second layer of this story, and this is where it becomes genuinely chilling, because even if the specific numbers are inflated, even if the most extreme elements of this claim dissolve under scrutiny, the underlying intelligence question refuses to disappear. How did Iran know enough about the internal architecture of Israeli defense infrastructure to construct a claim this specific? Psychological operations require a foundation. You cannot fabricate granular operational detail without possessing some portion of real intelligence. The descriptions that accompanied the IRGC announcement, details about corridors, security protocols, staff rotations, suggest either a deeply embedded intelligence source, a sophisticated cyber penetration campaign, or something even more disturbing. an actual physical presence within or adjacent to a structure that was supposed to be among the most impenetrable on Earth. Israel's response, or more accurately, its initial non-response, was itself a communication. In the modern doctrine of information warfare, how you respond to a claim shapes the narrative as powerfully as the claim itself. A flat denial issued too quickly appears defensive. A silence that extends past a certain threshold begins to confirm through absence. The Israeli military apparatus, which has historically been among the most aggressive in the world at managing its own media narrative, chose in the critical first window to say very little. Security correspondents for major Israeli outlets reported that an emergency consultation had been convened. Former intelligence officials appeared on Israeli television to discuss the claim, but they discussed the nature of IRGC propaganda rather than the specific denial of specific events. That framing choice was noticed. It was noticed in Riyadh, in Ankara, in Moscow, and it was noticed in Tehran. Meanwhile, in Washington, the silence carried its own geometry. The Pentagon issued no immediate statement. The State Department, when pressed, gave a response that was notable for its careful language. Neither a denial of the casualty claim nor a direct engagement with the specifics of where American forces may or may not have been operating in proximity to Israeli defense infrastructure. And this is the thread that, when pulled, begins to unravel something enormous. Because the question of what American personnel were doing inside or near the Israeli Ministry of Defense compound is itself a classified conversation, one that exists within the intersection of joint intelligence operations, weapons technology transfer agreements, and the kind of deep operational coordination between the two militaries that rarely surfaces in public documentation but defines the actual architecture of their alliance. The Middle East at this particular moment is not the Middle East of 5 years ago. The Abraham Accords reshaped the surface geography of Arab-Israeli relations while leaving the subterranean fault lines untouched. The normalization deals brought economic relationships and intelligence sharing into the open, but they also created new pressure points, new targets, and new strategic anxieties for actors like Iran who watched their regional influence being deliberately encircled. Every new alignment that Israel forged, with Bahrain, with the UAE, with the quiet but unmistakable rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, was understood in Tehran not as a peace initiative, but as the tightening of a strategic noose. The IRGC response doctrine to encirclement is not retreat. It is escalation. It is the deliberate injection of chaos at the point of maximum psychological impact. And on this night, the point of maximum psychological impact was that building in Tel Aviv. You also cannot analyze this moment without confronting the domestic political dimensions on every side of it. Iran's regime is under pressure that has not eased since the uprising of 2022. The economy is fractured. The currency has been in sustained collapse. The generational rupture between the Islamic Republic's founding ideology and the aspirations of its young population is not a political problem. It is an existential one. Regimes under this kind of internal stress have historically sought external theater, not just distraction, that word is too simple, but reconsolidation, a moment that allows the state to wrap itself in the narrative of defiant resistance, to point at an external enemy and say, look at what we are capable of, look at what we have done to those who sought to break us. That narrative serves a purpose that goes far beyond the battlefield. It is a performance of legitimacy addressed as much to the Iranian people as to the world watching from outside. And yet, and this is where the story refuses to resolve into comfortable simplicity, the geopolitical consequences of even a partially true version of this claim are staggering in ways that most commentary has barely begun to map. Consider the scenario in which some meaningful element of the IRGC's assertion reflects actual events, that Iranian operatives, whether physical or cyber, achieved a penetration of Israeli defense infrastructure at a level that enabled the collection of sensitive information about American personnel stationed or operating within that infrastructure. If that is even partially what happened, then what we are witnessing is not a claim of battlefield victory. It is the announcement of an intelligence catastrophe, one with implications that reach into the architecture of the entire Western security framework in the Middle East. The relationship between American and Israeli intelligence is among the most intimate in the world, and among the most carefully guarded. The networks they share, the technologies they co-develop, the operational coordination they conduct at the deepest levels of classified activity, all of this represents decades of accumulated trust and technological investment. A single successful deep penetration operation against that infrastructure, whether the vehicle was a human source, a digital intrusion, or a combination of both, would not just yield tactical intelligence. It would potentially expose the architecture of the alliance itself: names, protocols, communication channels, the identity of assets operating across the broader region. This is why, in the intelligence community, the term catastrophic breach is not used lightly, and why, if there is substance beneath the IRGC's claim, the silence from both Tel Aviv and Washington suddenly becomes the most rational response available. There is also the question of what this moment means for the broader trajectory of the conflict between Israel and Iran, a conflict that has for years operated in what strategists call the gray zone, that space between declared peace and open war where covert operations, targeted assassinations, cyber attacks, and proxy engagement substitute for the kind of direct confrontation that both sides have understood would trigger consequences neither could fully control. The gray zone has been enormously productive for both sides. Israel has conducted hundreds of strikes on Iranian weapons convoys and military positions in Syria. Iran has armed and directed Hezbollah, funded Hamas, and expanded its missile arsenal to a degree that fundamentally altered the regional threat calculus. But the gray zone has an edge, and the question that military planners in every major capital are now asking, quietly, urgently, behind closed doors, is whether that edge has just been crossed. Because if the IRGC's claim contains operational truth, if Iranian assets did breach a facility that houses American personnel in a country with which the United States has a de facto military alliance, then the legal and strategic frameworks that have governed American restraint in the Iranian theater are under extraordinary pressure. The authorization for use of military force, the rules of engagement, the threshold conditions under which a direct American military response to Iran becomes not just permissible but politically and strategically necessary. All of those frameworks were constructed around a set of assumptions about what Iran would and would not dare to do. This claim, if verified, represents a demolition of those assumptions, and demolishing assumptions in international security is never a neutral event. It is always the beginning of something. The regional actors watching this unfold are not passive observers. Saudi Arabia, which has been conducting its own careful recalibration of its relationship with Iran following the Chinese-brokered normalization agreement, now faces a moment of acute strategic discomfort. The normalization was always fragile, a diplomatic architecture built on shared economic interest but profoundly undermined by the deep sectarian, historical, and geopolitical tensions that normalization agreements cannot dissolve. If Iran has genuinely struck at the heart of the Israeli-American security nexus, Riyadh must now reassess whether the rapprochement it carefully constructed offers it any meaningful protection, or whether it has simply placed it in a more exposed position relative to a Tehran that is demonstrating a willingness to escalate in ways the Gulf monarchies had calculated it would not. Turkey's position is similarly complex. Ankara has spent years cultivating a posture of strategic ambiguity, maintaining NATO membership while expanding economic and energy ties with Russia, developing trade relationships with Iran while publicly condemning IRGC activities in the region, selling drones to Ukraine while seeking to position itself as a mediator. That posture of deliberate ambiguity has been commercially profitable and diplomatically flexible, but it depends on a degree of regional stability that allows Turkey to play multiple sides without being forced to choose. An event that collapses the gray zone and forces a binary alignment between the Western security architecture and the Iran-Russia-China alignment is precisely the scenario that threatens the entire foundation of Erdogan's strategic model. And then there is China, watching with the kind of careful attention that reveals itself not in statements, but in the movement of assets and the quiet recalibration of strategic bets. Beijing's relationship with Tehran has deepened significantly in recent years. The 25-year Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement signed in 2021 was not merely an economic document. It was a strategic signal that China was prepared to absorb the political cost of deeper alignment with Iran in exchange for the geostrategic benefits of having a capable, aggressive regional actor continuously bleeding American attention and resources in the Middle East. If Iran has now demonstrated a capability that challenges the fundamental security of American partners in the region, China's internal assessment of Tehran's value as a strategic asset will shift upward. And with it, China's willingness to provide the diplomatic cover, the economic lifelines, and potentially the technology transfers that would allow Iran to sustain and expand that capability. The human dimension of this story, the dimension that is easiest to lose beneath the weight of strategic analysis, is this. Behind every number in a casualty claim are people, families, parents who received calls that rearranged their entire existence, children who will grow up with absences they can never fully explain. If any portion of the American casualties claimed by the IRGC reflects reality, then somewhere in this country there are people who are experiencing the specific irreversible grief that comes from losing someone in a conflict that the official record may never fully describe. That grief does not care about classification levels. It does not care about strategic ambiguity or gray zone doctrine or the diplomatic calculus of how to respond to a claim without confirming it. It is simply the weight of a world that has changed, suddenly, violently, and without asking permission. The script of this moment is still being written. The intelligence communities of a dozen nations are running analysis on the IRGC's claim right now, triangulating signals intelligence, reviewing satellite imagery, cross-referencing human source networks, looking for the seam between the fabricated and the factual. The diplomatic channels are lit up with traffic that will never be made public. The military planners are modeling response scenarios that range from the carefully calibrated to the catastrophic. And the people in Tel Aviv and Tehran and Washington, in the villages of southern Lebanon, in the camps of Gaza, in the streets of cities across a region that has known almost no decade without war, are watching, waiting, and wondering whether what has just been claimed is the beginning of something that cannot be undone. What is certain, regardless of how the specific details of this claim ultimately resolve, is that the world has entered a new phase. The psychological threshold that once separated a regional conflict from a global confrontation has been publicly challenged in a way that cannot be unchallenged. The rules of the gray zone have been rewritten, or at least subjected to a stress test of unprecedented public visibility. And the question that will define the next weeks, the next months, and potentially the next years of this conflict is not simply whether Iran did what it claims. The deeper question, the one that keeps strategic thinkers awake, the one that hums beneath every conversation in every secure facility that is having this conversation right now, is this. If they did it once, what are they planning to do next? And who on the other side of this has the will, the capability, and the moral clarity to answer in a way that ends the escalation rather than accelerating it toward the edge that no one, no government, no army, no ideology, has the power to walk the world back from once it has been crossed.